The room laughed when Desmond Lark dropped to one knee and drew two circles on the concrete floor. "Is this a joke?" someone muttered. A senior engineer crossed his arms. "Move out of the way, you're not supposed to be here." A maintenance worker, night shift, a worn uniform and calloused hands crouching beside a $100 million engine that the best engineers in the building had failed to fix for 3 weeks. What none of them knew, not the lead engineers, not the investors waiting upstairs, not even the CEO standing just feet away, was that Desmond had once trained in aviation mechanics, that he had spent years learning to hear what machines were trying to say. He was a single father who had buried his career to raise his daughter alone. So what exactly did Desmond see on that floor that every expert in the room had missed? If you've ever been the person in the room that nobody thought to ask, this one's for you. Stay with me, because this story doesn't go where you think it's going. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. I tell stories like this one every week, real, human, and worth your time. Hangar 6 at Pinewater Executive Airfield sat at the eastern edge of Savannah, Georgia, far enough from the city that you couldn't hear anything but wind and the occasional test rotation of a turbine blade. It was the kind of facility that didn't appear on public maps, a clean, climate-controlled testing ground built for exactly one purpose: to turn expensive ideas into working machines. That morning, the most expensive idea Stratanova Propulsion had ever produced was sitting in the center of the hangar floor, completely silent, surrounded by people who had run out of answers. The Mistral X was not just an engine. It was 3 years of research, 2 rounds of investor funding, and the professional reputation of every senior engineer who had signed their name to the project. A hybrid aviation propulsion system designed to carry heavy cargo at lower fuel cost over longer distances. It was the kind of technology that didn't come around often, the kind that, if it worked, would redefine an entire industry. Stratanova had built its next 5 years around it, and for 3 weeks it had refused to start. Ria Montrose arrived at the hangar at 6:45 that morning, 45 minutes before the first investor shuttle was scheduled to land. She was dressed the way she always dressed for high-stakes mornings: dark blazer, no jewelry, hair pulled back as if removing anything decorative was a way of signaling that she had not come to perform. She had come to solve. Ria had built Stratanova from a mid-size aerospace supplier into a serious propulsion company over 8 years, and she had done it by being exactly the kind of person who did not accept the phrase, "we're working on it," without a hard deadline attached. She was not unkind, but she was precise, and precision had a way of feeling cold to people who were used to being given more time than they deserved. Clive Hargrove was already there when she arrived. He was standing at the primary diagnostic console with 2 members of his team scrolling through the same data logs he had reviewed the day before and the day before that. Clive was the best systems engineer Stratanova had, with 2 decades of aviation propulsion experience and a wall of credentials that filled an entire panel in his office. He was also, Ria had come to understand over the past 3 weeks, a man who was better at identifying what the problem was not than what it actually was. "Same readings," he said when she walked in without looking up. "Every subsystem is showing clean. Fuel delivery, ignition sequencing, thermal management, all within tolerance. On paper, this engine should be running." Ria looked at the Mistral X. "On paper," she said. "We're recommending a full disassembly of the pressure regulation cluster. Run new simulations from baseline. It's the only way to be certain." "How long?" Clive finally looked at her. 10 days, maybe 12. The investors were landing in 45 minutes. Ria did not say anything for a moment. She walked toward the engine, stood close enough to rest a hand on the outer casing if she had wanted to, and looked at it the way you look at something you have given everything to and are not yet ready to give up on. Then she turned back to the room and told Clive's team to run the startup sequence one more time. Not because she believed it would work, because she needed to see it fail again with her own eyes before she made any decisions. That was when Desmond Lark pushed his equipment cart through the side entrance. He came in the way he always came in, quietly, efficiently, without announcing himself. The cart held his standard kit inspection tools, a torque calibration set, spare sensor fittings, a box of chalk markers he used for floor-level diagnostics when checking for vibration transfer points under heavy machinery. He had been assigned to Hangar 6 for 8 months, working the overnight shift, which meant he was usually the last person in the building at night and among the first back in the early morning to clear the floor before the day team arrived. He knew every corner of that space. He knew where the lighting flickered, where the drainage ran slow, where the concrete had been re-poured unevenly 3 years ago and still settled differently from the rest of the floor when the temperature dropped. To the engineers on Clive's team, Desmond was invisible in the way that service workers often are in high-pressure professional environments, present but unacknowledged, like the furniture or the overhead ventilation. Nobody had ever asked him what he thought about anything happening in that hangar. Nobody had ever needed to. What they did not know, and had never thought to find out, was that Desmond had spent 4 years in an aviation mechanics program before his life rearranged itself into something he hadn't planned for. He had a daughter named Mara who was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes, and who had been in Desmond's sole care since she was 2 when her mother passed from an illness that came too fast and left too little time to prepare. After that, finishing a certification program became a luxury he couldn't hold on to. He took the jobs that were available, the ones that paid reliably and had shift schedules he could work around school pickup and doctor's appointments, and the particular arithmetic of raising a child alone. He ended up in maintenance because maintenance was honest physical work that he understood, and because the overnight shift at Strata Nova paid better than most and asked nothing of him after 7 in the morning. But he never stopped listening to machines. That was the thing about the kind of knowledge Desmond carried. It didn't go away just because your circumstances changed. You spent enough years learning to feel the difference between a healthy turbine and a struggling one, learning to hear the specific language of metal under stress, and that knowledge became part of how you moved through the world. He didn't read it in reports. He heard it. He was passing the aft section of the Mistral X when Clive's team ran the startup sequence. The engine didn't fire. But what Desmond heard in the half-second before it failed, a very faint, strangled hesitation in the pressure transition, like something catching on itself mid-breath, stopped him where he stood. He didn't move for a moment. He stood very still, the way a person stands when they are trying not to interrupt a sound they need to hear again. Then he looked down at the concrete floor beneath the auxiliary valve housing. There were 2 faint marks on the floor, not drawn-formed. One was a pale circular ring of dried condensation under the auxiliary pressure valve cluster, the kind that built up when a seal was releasing micro-pressure during thermal cycling. The other was a thin gray arc of metallic dust beneath the rear engine mount, exactly the kind of residue that appeared when a base plate was vibrating in a direction it wasn't designed to vibrate. On their own, both marks were easy to dismiss as ordinary residue, the kind of thing you cleaned off the floor without a second thought. But together, positioned exactly where they were relative to each other, they told a story. Desmond set down his cart. He crouched and looked at both marks, carefully tracking the geometry between them. The auxiliary pressure valve and the base vibration sensor were not supposed to interact during startup. They operated on separate subsystems with separate feedback loops. But if the base plate had shifted even slightly enough to feed the wrong vibration signature into the sensor, and if the auxiliary valve was closing a fraction late due to a worn retention ring, then the 2 faults would converge at exactly the same moment in the ignition cycle. The system wouldn't detect either problem individually because neither one crossed the threshold for an error flag on its own. But together, at the same instant, they would trigger the engine's protective lockout before ignition could complete. The engine wasn't broken. It was scared of itself. Desmond stood up. He looked across the hangar at Clive's team gathered around the console, already deep in another round of log review. He looked at Rhea Montrose, who was standing with her arms crossed near the front of the engine, staring at it with an expression that sat somewhere between exhaustion and refusal. He knew what would happen if he walked over and said something. He had been in enough rooms like this to know exactly how a man in a maintenance uniform was received when he interrupted a conversation between credentialed engineers. The specific quality of that look, not hostile exactly, just blank, the way people look when they are waiting for someone to finish saying something irrelevant so they can continue with the actual work. He reached into his cart and pulled out a chalk marker. He walked to the two spots on the floor, crouched down again, and drew a clean white circle around each mark. One under the auxiliary valve housing, one under the rear mount. Clear, deliberate, large enough to be seen from across the room. The laughter came almost immediately. Not cruel, more reflexive, the kind that surfaces when something unexpected and apparently absurd breaks the tension of a serious situation. One of the younger engineers covered his mouth. Someone near the back of the room said under his breath, but not quietly enough, that they didn't need arts and crafts right now. Then Clive Hargrove turned from the console, registered what was happening, and walked forward with the energy of a man whose professional space has been interrupted. "What exactly are you doing?" Clive asked. Desmond looked up at him, still crouched. "Marking something." "Your maintenance," Clive said. "This is an active diagnostic review. You need to clear the floor." "I heard the startup sequence," Desmond said, standing now. He kept his voice level, not aggressive, not apologetic. "There's a pressure hesitation right before the lockout engages. It's not in the data because neither fault clears the error threshold on its own, but they're happening at the same time." He pointed to the first circle. "Auxiliary valve closing, late retention rings worn. Minor, nobody would flag it." He pointed to the second circle. "Base plate shifted, probably during the last equipment move. It's feeding a false vibration signature into the sensor. Also minor, but when both happen simultaneously during startup transition, the system reads it as an instability event and locks out before ignition completes." The room was quiet. Clive stared at the two circles on the floor. Then he looked at Desmond. His expression had not changed exactly, but something behind it had a slight recalibration, like a person who has just heard something they weren't expecting and hasn't yet decided what to do with it. "You've been on the night shift," Clive said carefully. "You're not a systems engineer." "No," Desmond agreed. "Then I'm going to need you to step back and let the team." "Clive," Rhea Montrose's voice came from across the room. She had not moved from where she was standing, but her attention had shifted entirely. She was looking at Desmond, not at the circles, at him. There was something in her expression that Desmond couldn't quite read, not belief exactly, not yet, but the alertness of someone who has been presented with something unexpected and is still deciding whether it matters. "What's your name?" she asked. "Desmond Lark. How long have you been working this building?" 8 months. Rhea looked at the two chalk circles on the concrete floor. She looked at the engine. She looked back at Desmond. The investors were going to land in 30 minutes. Clive's team had burned 3 weeks and come back with nothing but a recommendation to disassemble and restart from the beginning. And a man she had never spoken to in a uniform that did not carry a single engineering credential was standing in front of her telling her he had found the answer on the floor. She had two choices. She had always known in the back of her mind that leadership was not really about knowing the most. It was about being honest enough to recognize when the answer was coming from somewhere you didn't expect, and brave enough or desperate enough to listen. 5 minutes, she said, looking directly at Desmond. You have 5 minutes to show me what you found. If you're wrong, you leave the floor. If you're right, she let the sentence hang unfinished for a moment, then everyone in this room is going to listen to you. Clive started to object. Rhea cut him off with a look. Desmond didn't say thank you. He didn't look relieved or grateful or vindicated. He just turned, looked at the two circles one more time, and walked toward the auxiliary control panel. He had 5 minutes, and he already knew exactly what he was going to do with them. The first thing Clive Hargrove did was ask Desmond to explain the pressure differential equation governing the auxiliary valve's response window during cold start sequencing. It was not a genuine question. Everyone in the room understood that. It was the kind of question asked by someone who already knows the answer and is using it as a gateway of establishing in front of an audience that the person being questioned does not belong in the conversation. Clive delivered it with the flat, patient tone of a man who has already decided the outcome and is simply performing the formality of allowing the other person to fail on their own. Desmond didn't answer it like someone trying to pass a test. He turned from the auxiliary control panel, looked at Clive directly, and said that the valve's response window wasn't the issue. The retention ring controlling its closure rate was. If the ring had even marginal wear, the valve would lag by a fraction of a cycle. Not enough to flag an error, enough to matter. He wasn't reciting a formula. He was describing what he had already concluded from what he'd heard and seen. And his certainty was the kind that doesn't come from memorizing documentation. It comes from being around machinery long enough that machinery stops feeling like a system and starts feeling like a language. Clive crossed his arms. Two of the junior engineers exchanged a look that said they weren't sure what to do with what they were hearing. The room hadn't warmed to Desmond, not yet, but it had stopped laughing. There is a specific quality of silence that replaces laughter when something unexpected turns out to be harder to dismiss than anticipated, and that quality had settled over Hangar 6 like a change in air pressure. Rhea stood back and watched. She had spent 8 years building a company by learning to read rooms, not the PowerPoint presentations or the quarterly projections, but the actual human temperature of a space, the way people moved and deflected and occasionally, rarely told the truth without meaning to. What she was reading in Desmond Lark right now was something she hadn't encountered in a long time. He wasn't performing competence. He wasn't managing anyone's perception of him. He was just working in the same steady, economical way he probably worked every night when the hangar was empty and nobody was watching. That was harder to fake than any credential. "I need the cover panel removed from the auxiliary valve housing," Desmond said, addressing the room rather than any single person. "And I need a vibration calibration bar placed under the rear engine mount, the aft left foot specifically. Right on the mark I drew." Clive's response was immediate. "That's not part of any approved diagnostic procedure. If we disturb the valve housing without a full protocol review, we risk introducing contamination into—" "Clive!" Rhea's voice was quiet, but it carried. "Open the panel." The look Clive gave her lasted exactly long enough to communicate everything he couldn't say out loud. Then he turned and gave the instruction to his team. It took 4 minutes to remove the cover panel from the auxiliary valve housing. During those 4 minutes, Desmond stood to the side of the engine with his arms at his sides and said nothing. He didn't pace. He didn't check his watch. He had the stillness of someone who has already done the hardest part of the work, the thinking, and is now simply waiting for the physical world to catch up with what he already knows. Rhea found herself watching him more than she watched the technicians working on the panel, which told her something about where she thought the real information was going to come from. When the cover came off, the first person to look into the valve housing was a young engineer named Preston, who was part of Clive's core team and had been on the project since its second phase. He leaned in with a flashlight, stayed there for several seconds longer than the inspection should have required, and then straightened up without saying anything. His expression did the talking, a specific kind of technical surprise. The look of a person who has just found something that shouldn't be there and is rapidly rearranging their understanding of the past 3 weeks in light of it. "There's a wear groove on the retention ring," Preston said. He said it carefully, like a man choosing his words on a surface he is no longer sure is stable. "Minor. The tolerances still read within spec, but—" He stopped, looked at Clive. "It would cause a lag, small, maybe half a cycle at the transition point." Nobody looked at Desmond directly, but the room's attention had reorganized itself around him in a way that was impossible to miss. Clive moved to the second mark on the floor, the chalk circle beneath the rear engine mount, and crouched to examine the base plate himself. He ran a hand along the mounting foot, checking the seating of the vibration dampening pad. When he stood back up, his face carried an expression that Rhea had never seen on him before in 8 years of working together. It was not quite humility. It was the early, uncomfortable stage just before humility. The moment when a person realizes that the story they've been telling themselves about a situation is not accurate, and the new version requires them to account for how the old version stayed in place for so long. "The dampening pad is out of position," Clive said. "Maybe 2 millimeters of lateral shift. It happened during the equipment relocation last month." He did not look at Desmond when he said it. "It would generate a false resonance reading. The sensor would interpret it as an instability event," Desmond said. "And at the exact same moment the valve lags, the system gets 2 signals it doesn't like simultaneously, so it locks out. Every time." The hangar was very quiet. 2 marks on a concrete floor. 1 worn retention ring. 1 shifted dampening pad. 3 weeks of full senior engineering team and every piece of diagnostic software Stratanova owned, and the answer had been sitting in the residue patterns on the floor the entire time, visible to anyone paying attention to the right things. Ria's phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out. A message from Bianca Soto, her executive assistant who was managing the investor group in the observation suite upstairs. "They're asking if we're running behind. Do I tell them we're delaying? Need a decision now." Ria typed back, "Stand by, 2 minutes." She looked up at Desmond. "What's the fix?" Desmond described it without hesitation. Quarter-turn clockwise adjustment on the retention ring, just enough to restore the correct closure rate without requiring a full replacement. Reseat the dampening pad to its original position using the vibration marks on the floor as reference. Then, run a 10-second cold cycle check before switching to live ignition sequence. The cold cycle would let the system recalibrate its sensor baseline before the real startup load hit. It was not a complicated fix. That was almost the most remarkable thing about it. 3 weeks of advanced diagnostics, and the solution was something that could be completed with standard tools in under 15 minutes. Clive stepped forward. "That ignition resequence is outside the tested parameters," he said, and there was something different in his resistance now. Not authority exactly, but the momentum of a man who has been the most knowledgeable person in the room for a very long time and doesn't yet know how to stand somewhere that's no longer true. "If the cold cycle doesn't clear the sensor cache properly, we could drive the system into a deeper lockout state. We'd lose the ability to attempt another startup today. The presentation would be over." "The presentation is already over if we do nothing," Ria said. "I'm saying we should not be making this call based on what?" Desmond's voice was even not raised, but it cut through the room with the weight that comes from having nothing to prove and nothing to protect. "Say it." Clive didn't finish the sentence. "Titles don't make engines run," Desmond said. "The right cause does, and I've told you the cause." He looked at Clive, then at the rest of the team, and there was no anger in his face, just the clear-eyed steadiness of a man who has been underestimated so many times that it stopped feeling personal a long time ago. "If I'm wrong, the engine doesn't start, and you're exactly where you were 20 minutes ago. Nothing is worse. But I'm not wrong." Ria made her decision. She told the team to implement the retention ring adjustment and reseat the dampening pad. She told Bianca to hold the investors for 15 minutes and not to call it a delay, to call it a final systems verification. And then she stepped back and let Desmond direct the work. He was precise and unhurried. He watched the retention ring adjustment with the same focused quiet he'd brought to everything else that morning, confirming the torque by feel as much as by the indicator, the way someone does when they trust their hands to tell them things that instruments sometimes miss. When the dampening pad was reseated against the reference marks on the floor, he crouched and checked the contact surface by eye from 2 angles before he was satisfied. Then he stood, looked at the rear mount one more time, and told the team they were ready for the cold cycle. The control panel operator began the sequence. Every person in the hangar was still. The Mistral X hummed. The cold cycle engaged. Systems began their pre-ignition calibration sweep. For 9 seconds, everything sounded exactly the way it was supposed to sound. The sensor readings normalizing, the pressure indicators climbing in the right sequence, the baseline recalibrating. On the 10th second, the startup attempt transferred to live ignition, and the engine went silent. Nothing. No catch, no rumble, no ignition. The system had not locked out, it had simply not fired. The silence landed differently than the silences before it. Heavier, more final, charged with everything that had been staked on the past 15 minutes. The temperature in the room changed. Not the air, the people. Clive's jaw set. The younger engineers stopped looking at Desmond and started looking at their screens the way people look at anything except the center of a situation when they want to distance themselves from it. Someone near the back of the room exhaled through his nose, a small sound, but the kind that carries a specific meaning when you know what the room has been waiting for. Desmond stood with his back to most of the room, facing the engine. He was thinking. not panicking thinking. There was a difference, and Rhea, who had been watching him the entire time, could see it clearly. His eyes moved across the control panel readout without urgency, following something in the data that he was still working through. Bianca's next message arrived. Investors asking directly, "I need an answer." Clive turned to Rhea. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His expression said everything he had been holding back since Desmond drew the first circle on the floor, and it said it with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has been waiting to be proven right about something they didn't want to be right about. Then, Desmond spoke. "The sensor cache," he said. "It's still holding the old lockout data. The system ran the cold cycle, but it didn't clear the error state from the previous failed attempts. It's trying to start with a contaminated baseline." He turned from the panel, and his voice carried the same quality it had held throughout the entire morning. Calm, certain, indifferent to whether the room believed him. "Clear the secondary warning loop. Full reset. Then run the startup again in the exact sequence I gave you, not the standard sequence, mine." Clive took a breath. "If we force a cache reset without a—" "Clive," Rhea said his name one more time quietly with a finality that ended the argument before it started. She looked at the clock on the wall. She looked at the 2 chalk circles on the floor, still there, still clean and white against the gray concrete, like the simplest possible map to the answer everyone had been looking for. She looked at Desmond, who was looking at the engine with an expression that held no doubt in it at all, only the steady patience of a man who has already seen the end of the story and is waiting for everyone else to get there. "Clear the cache," she said. "Run his sequence." The operator's hands moved across the panel. The secondary warning loop was reset. The startup parameters were entered in the exact order Desmond had specified. A beat passed where the system processed the new inputs, and the hangar held its breath in the way that places hold their breath, not in the people exactly, but in the quality of the air itself, the way sound seemed to pull back from the walls. Desmond looked at the 2 chalk circles one last time, then he nodded. "Start it." The system took 2 seconds to process the new inputs. On the 3rd second, a low vibration moved through the floor, not from the engine itself, but from the building responding to something large waking up inside it. The 4th second carried a sound nobody in Hangar 6 had heard from the Mistral X in 3 weeks. A deep, pressurized intake, like a breath finally released after being held too long. And then on the 5th second, the engine caught. It didn't sputter, it didn't hesitate. It opened into a full, sustained roar that filled the hangar from floor to ceiling, the kind of sound that doesn't just enter through the ears, but moves through the chest and the walls and the concrete simultaneously. Every indicator on the primary console swept into the green. Pressure readings stable, thermal output nominal, fuel delivery locked. The Mistral X was running cleanly, powerfully, without a single anomalous reading across the entire diagnostic board. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The engineers stood at their stations and watched their screens with the stillness of people processing the distance between what they had expected to see and what they were actually seeing. Preston kept his eyes on the thermal readout long after it was clear the numbers were good, as if he needed them to hold steady for a few more seconds before he could fully trust them. The operator at the primary console sat with both hands resting on the edge of the panel and stared at the ignition confirmation light, solid green, unwavering, like a man who had prepared himself for a story to be false and was now quietly reckoning with the fact that it wasn't. Clive Hargrove stood at the edge of the console area with his data tablet at his side, not raised, not in use. He was looking at the engine. His face had reorganized itself into something that Rhea had no precise word for. Not shame exactly, not defeat, but the expression of a person in the middle of understanding something true about themselves that they would rather have learned in private. He had spent 3 weeks in that hangar with every resource available to him, and the answer had been on the floor. Rhea Montrose did not cheer. She did not look at anyone for the first few seconds after ignition. She stood in front of the running Mistral X and let the sound of it move through her the way she had imagined it would on the day she first approved the project 3 years ago, when it was still a proposal and a set of projections and a room full of people telling her it was possible. She had believed them then. She still believed in the engine, but something else was moving through her now alongside the relief, something less comfortable and more necessary. A reckoning. The engine had been silent for 3 weeks. The right answer had been present in that building every single night, and the person who carried it had spent 8 months in that hangar without anyone thinking to ask him a single question. She turned and looked for Desmond. He was standing where he had been standing when he gave the start command, a few feet back from the control panel, slightly apart from the cluster of engineers in the same position he had occupied for most of the morning, present but not centered, visible but not quite included. He was looking at the engine the way Rhea imagined he had looked at machines his entire working life, attentively, quietly reading it the way other people read texts, checking for details that only became visible if you already knew what to look for. He was not watching the celebration that hadn't yet started. He was watching the engine breathe. He had already wiped the chalk from his hands. The white residue was gone from his palms, absorbed into the cloth he kept in his work belt. He looked from a distance exactly the same as he had looked when he walked through the side entrance that morning with his equipment cart. A man in a maintenance uniform at the beginning of an ordinary shift. Except that nothing about the past hour had been ordinary, and the engine roaring 20 feet away was the proof of it. Rhea walked over to him directly without calculating the approach or preparing what she was going to say. "I'd like to talk to you," she said. "After the investor presentation, can you stay?" Desmond looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not suspicious, but was careful. The carefulness of someone who has learned not to assume that recognition once offered is necessarily the kind that lasts. "I have to pick up my daughter at 3, he said. "I'll make sure you're done before noon," Rhea said. "I promise." He held her gaze for another beat, then nodded. The investor presentation lasted 45 minutes. Rhea delivered it from the observation deck above Hangar 6, with the Mistral X running below them, its roar transmitting through the floor-to-ceiling glass as a continuous vibration that no presentation slide could have matched. The investors, 7 people representing 3 separate capital groups, who had been patient for 3 weeks and were running out of patience, watched the engine run for the full duration and asked their questions in the tone of people who have been given back something they were beginning to think was lost. The meeting ended with handshakes, and the kind of forward-looking conversation that only happens when the fundamental question has been resolved. Rhea found Desmond in the side corridor adjacent to the hangar, returning his equipment cart to the maintenance staging area. The Mistral X had been brought to a controlled idle by Clive's team to preserve the run data, and its low, continuous hum moved through the building's walls like a heartbeat. She asked Desmond to sit with her in the small briefing room off the main corridor, and he followed her there without ceremony. She closed the door, sat across from him at the narrow table, and asked him directly how he had known what to look for. Desmond organized his thoughts for a moment, then told her in the same straightforward way he had explained everything else that morning about the program he'd started years before. Aviation mechanics. 2 years in, heading into the certification track when his wife was diagnosed. He described it without self-pity, the way people describe the facts of their lives when they have had a long time to make peace with them. After she died, finishing the program was not a priority he could afford to hold anymore. Mara was 2 years old. There were things that mattered more than a certificate on a wall, and he had chosen them with his eyes open. He ended up in maintenance because it kept him close to work he understood, and because the overnight shift at a propulsion facility meant he spent his nights around exactly the kind of machinery he had once studied, not operating it, not designing it, but present with it, which was its own kind of education. You learned things about machines that way that you didn't learn in controlled conditions. You learned how they sounded when no one was watching. You learned the difference between a healthy idle and a troubled one, between vibration that meant nothing and vibration that was trying to tell you something. Rhea listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she told him the truth as she understood it, that what he had just described was not a gap in his qualifications. It was a gap in Stratanova's ability to recognize where its qualifications actually lived. She had built a company that was very good at reading resumes and very poor at reading rooms. She had spent 3 years developing an engine that could distinguish between good resonance and bad, and had completely failed to notice that she employed a person with the same ability, and had been walking him past that engine every night for 8 months. She offered him a position on Stratanova's technical diagnostics team, a small group that operated across departments brought in specifically to review systems that standard diagnostic processes were missing. It was not a charity offer, she told him. It was a correction. The work was real. The role was real. And the reason she was making the offer was not only because she felt guilty, though she did, but because she had watched him work that morning and understood that putting that ability back in a maintenance closet would be a specific kind of waste she was not willing to keep participating in. The position paid 3 times his current salary, with a daytime schedule and built-in flexibility. Desmond was quiet for a long time after that. Not deliberating about the offer, she could see the deliberation was already done. He was somewhere else for a moment, in an interior space that the offer had opened up, and Rhea let him stay there without rushing him back. She thought she understood at least partially what was happening. Not just the practical reality of better hours and better pay, but something larger, the weight of being seen after a long period of invisibility, and the complicated feelings that came with it. Because being seen meant also reckoning with how long you hadn't been. "I'll need to arrange something for Mara's pickups," he said finally, "but I can make it work." He said it simply in the voice of a man who has spent years making things work and knows the phrase carries more than it appears to. Before they left the briefing room, Rhea told him there was one more thing she intended to do. She was going to ask Clive Hargrove to address the team directly, not to apologize as a performance, but to account for what had happened honestly. Not because Clive was a bad engineer or a bad person, but because what had occurred that morning was not purely a diagnostic failure. It was a failure of the kind of listening a team needs in order to function well, and that failure had a name and needed to be spoken out loud in the same room where it had happened. Desmond said he didn't need Clive to do anything on his account. Rhea said she understood, but the team did. That afternoon, Clive stood in front of the full engineering group in Hangar 6 and said what needed to be said. He said it without the ease of a prepared speech, which made it more credible, halting in places too direct in others, but honest in a way that could not be mistaken for performance. He said that he had allowed his assumptions about where expertise was permitted to live to prevent him from hearing something true when it was offered to him. He said it was not the kind of mistake he expected to make, which was precisely why he had made it. The room received it with the complicated quiet of people being asked to hold 2 things at once: respect for a man they had worked alongside for years, and acknowledgement that he had been wrong in a way that cost 3 weeks and nearly cost everything. When Clive was done, Desmond, standing at the back of the room, nodded once. Not forgiveness exactly, recognition. The acknowledgement that something true had been said, which was enough. Rhea watched from the side and understood with a clarity that had been building all morning that this was not only what she had needed to fix today, it was what she had needed to fix for a long time. Stratanova had grown by being disciplined, precise, and technically excellent, and all of those things remained true. But somewhere in that growth, the company had built a structure of authority with the wrong kind of ceiling on the wrong people. A ceiling made not of policy, but of assumption. The quiet daily assumption that expertise arrived wearing the right uniform, carrying the right title, sitting in the right meetings. She had watched an engine come back to life that morning because one person had been paying attention in a way that all of her expensive systems had not. The least she could do was make sure the building that housed that engine was organized around people, not credentials. In the weeks that followed, Rhea launched an internal program to identify talent within departments that had historically been overlooked. Maintenance, overnight operations, equipment inspection, logistics. She began spending time on the operational floors, talking with people whose names she had never known, asking questions she should have been asking for years. The conversations were not always comfortable. Some of them told her things about her own company that she would have preferred not to hear. She listened anyway. 2 chalk circles on the concrete floor of Hangar 6 were never fully scrubbed away. Rhea had a thin, transparent sealant applied over them, not as a monument, but as a reminder. A reminder that the most important thing in that building on that morning had not been the engine, or the investors, or the quarterly projections. It had been one person's willingness to crouch down and pay attention to what the floor was trying to say. Desmond called Mara at 2:45 from the parking lot of the airfield, leaning against his truck with the Georgia sun moving low across the tree line. Mara answered on the second ring the way she always did, slightly breathless, already mid-sentence describing something that had happened at school as if the conversation had already been going on and he had just joined it. He listened. He asked the right questions. He told her he was on his way. Before he hung up, she asked him if he'd had a good day at work. She asked him this most days with the earnest, practical curiosity of a child who understands that the answer matters but not yet all the reasons why. Desmond looked back at the airfield at the long, low roofline of Hangar 6 visible over the fence and thought about two chalk circles on a concrete floor. About an engine that had found its voice again. About a room full of people who had looked at him and seen the wrong thing for 8 months, and then, in the space of one morning, seen something closer to the truth. Yeah, he told her. Today was a good day. He got in the truck and drove towards school. Desmond didn't save that engine because he was lucky. He saved it because he never stopped paying attention, even when nobody was paying attention to him. There's something worth holding on to in that. Talent doesn't expire just because life gets in the way. The things you've learned, the skills you've built, the way you see problems that other people walk past, none of that disappears just because your circumstances changed or because the room hasn't learned to ask you yet. And for the leaders watching, the next person who solves your hardest problem might not be sitting in the corner office. They might be the one pushing a cart through the side door at 6 in the morning, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. If this story stayed with you, I'd love for you to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I look for stories exactly like this, the ones about people who were overlooked, underestimated, and quietly extraordinary. They're out there, and they deserve to be heard. See you in the next one.